A very warm welcome to all of our attendees. To get started with our Tuesday morning Toolbox Talks, we always want to encourage you to continually prevent COVID-19. This is obviously to wash your hands regularly with soap and water for 20 seconds. If this is not available, please use an alcohol-based hand sanitizer. Avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth with unwashed hands. Adhere to your social distancing measures, especially when people are sick. Covering a cough or sneeze with a flexed elbow or tissue and then throwing that tissue into the bin. And then one of the things that we always encourage you to do is clean and disinfect frequently touched objects and surfaces. If your company does have a COVID-19 vaccination policy, please adhere to those standards as well. Now, we know that COVID has been rising in a few areas and some people are going back to wearing masks in public. Obviously, this is your personal choice, and we would just obviously always look at what government statutes are for the wearing of masks in different areas or at different localities. To get started this morning, we are now looking at first aid or basic first aid treatment. That's looking at our first aid kits that we are using within our bakkies, or perhaps we have them in our offices. And many of us know that we have to have a first aid kit. But what must you know as a first aider? Perhaps you've gone for the training and it's been maybe a year or 2 years ago. Some certificates should last about 3 years for first aid. And you might not remember everything you've learned a year or 2 years ago. And that's because you're not doing it every single day. And we fully understand that. Many of us forget some of the training that we've done 2-3 years ago because you're just not using it all the time. But you have been appointed as a first aider, or perhaps you're not too sure when you must appoint a first aider. Well, we'll answer those questions for you this morning. But our safety thought, again, coming back to prevention is better than cure. We don't want to use those skills, and we hope you never use your skills as a basic first aider for your company, because that means somebody got injured. So if you are forgetting them, well, we don't feel that that's a good thing. We don't want to forget it, but we understand that it's human nature to forget. But that does mean that you are not using it. And that's obviously something that we are happy about, because we are trying to eliminate those incidents and accidents that are continually making us use first aid kits. Now, on that note, because we are speaking about basic first aid, incidents and accidents do occur. And from time to time, there are special requirements that will go out. Now, as IOPS are always wanting to keep ahead of occupational health and safety for the industry, we have sent out an email requesting from our members information on incidents and accidents that do occur. We'll remind you again at the end of this Toolbox Talk, because when that email was sent out, some had a question about the information that we are trying to get from our members. You'll notice that we are not going to be looking at any names or contact details or company names. We are just looking at the actual information of the incident that occurred. Either it occurred to yourself within your company or an incident that you have heard of, specifically around the plumbing industry. Now, why are we asking this? Well, the only reason why we are trying to gather this information is, first of all, to create statistics around what is actually happening in terms of incidents and accidents in the plumbing industry. This will then help us, together with other partners like FEM and SIOSH, who we sit with an occupational health and safety committee meeting together with, and we will then discuss what is actually happening in the industry. From there, we can then develop strategies to try and prevent these from happening again, or give you information, training, or perhaps some sort of other technology that we find that could actually prevent that from happening. Now, it is very big in the industry for us to continually to try and prevent road accidents, because that is one of the biggest life takers in terms of incidents and accidents. The roads are very dangerous, and thousands are being killed almost every week, every month. And so we will constantly focus on driver safety and driving safely, especially if you are working in the construction industry, because you have so many people in your vehicles. Then we also look at things like working at heights where people are falling to the same level, to a different level, or perhaps being bumped by or being crushed by certain things. Now, to be able to differentiate which industry is being affected, that is the reason we are asking you to reach out and tell us what you are facing. So please know, and this is will be told to you as well when you do reach out to us. We are not gathering any of this information to be used by third parties. It is only going to be used by our OPSA. The information on the incident itself and your personal information will not be divulged to anyone. We are only looking for the information of the actual incident. So what happened? And then we are going to look as incident investigators to try and determine what we can do to prevent that from happening to the next person. So if you have not received that email, please let us know. Even via our WhatsApp number 071-875-2070, and we can send you that link. Then if you have had any incidents or accidents, we understand some people don't want to divulge that information, but if you are able to do that, we would really appreciate those stats so that we can start assisting you a lot more. So let's look at basic first aid, because it does happen. Now, basic first aid, or the definition of basic first aid, is the immediate treatment for a casualty. If you are the first responder to the scene, then you are rendering assistance to key survival of a casualty. This means, obviously, you want to preserve a life, you prevent the condition from becoming worse, and then you promote the recovery of that person. And those are the three principles to first aid. Now, if you are not a first aider, and perhaps you have a first aider for your company, these are their principles. This is what a first aider is supposed to be doing. They want to preserve a life first. That is why most first aiders are taught basic first aid, and then it includes CPR, or cardiopulmonary resuscitation. That's just to resuscitate the heart and the breathing back to a normal standard, or to a livable standard. In other words, they're preserving that life until emergency services arrive so that they can take over. So when we talk about first aid, it is very basic. It is literally just keeping that person alive long enough so that professionals such as the EMS can actually take over. Now, this could either be when the ambulance arrives, or if you've taken the person to the hospital. The second principle is then preventing the condition from becoming worse. In other words, once the person is still alive, we don't want them to fall back into area of danger. And that could mean treating their wounds, treating shock, or anything that could potentially become worse. So you need to know how to treat shock. You need to know what shock is and identify the different types of shock. You also need to identify if the person is going to get worse because of the area that they are in, because of the movements that they have, or perhaps because of the wounds that they have sustained. And that's where the first aid box will then assist you in giving necessary first aid treatment to any wounds, bruises, burns, or anything that that person has sustained within a reasonable area of responsibility. And we'll explain what that means. And then we want to promote recovery. Now, promoting recovery means that when the person has had their first aid treatment, the promotion of recovery means that you want to constantly check in on the person. Remember, it's not just a once-off thing. You've been given your bandages and now we can leave you alone. The responsibility of a first aider is to remain there until the person is recovered. If you hand that over to the EMS, yes, you are no longer in charge of the physical person, but the recovery of the person will still continue even once they return to work. It is still the responsibility of the first aider to check in on that person to make sure that they're still doing okay. And this is where if a person is going back and forth to the hospitals, perhaps because of COVID, they need to visit the hospital on a few occasions, the first aider will still be there to ensure the person is getting that treatment. So you as a first aider, or if you are not a first aider, please support the first aider because they are needing to abide by these principles. Now, where does the need for a first aider come? So many companies will say, well, we've gone to a site, Chris, and they're asking for a first aider. Why do we need a first aider? Where does the law? It doesn't say so in the OSH Act. And you are 100% correct. The OSH Act does not talk about a first aider. But the OSH Act in section 42 does say that there are certain regulations that will be promulgated into the OSH Act. That is a supporting regulation, much like the construction regulations, which means if you're on a construction site, the OSH Act is still the superseding Occupational Health and Safety Act or legislation, but the construction regulations is also what you must follow while you are on site. The same is true with your general safety regulations. Because it is a general regulation, it affects any single company. So your GSR or General Safety Regulation Section 3 speaks about first aid, emergency equipment, and procedures that every single company must have. And here we've outlined the important ones that we want to chat to you about. And that is General Safety Regulation 3. And here you want to look at point 1. An employer shall take all reasonable steps that are necessary under the circumstances to ensure that a person at work receives prompt first aid treatment in case of an emergency. Now, it does not say that you have to have a first aider, does it? No, that's why we go to point 2, where you have 5 employees. So as soon as you have more than 5 employees, you must have a first aid box. All right, so once you have 5 employees, you have to have a first aid box. Now, what must you have in your first aid box? Well, the most basic first aid box is called a GSR 3 or a Regulation 3 first aid box. Now, that comes from Regulation 3.3, and that is taking into account the type of injuries that are likely to occur at a workplace, the nature of the activities performed, and the number of employees employed at such a workplace. The employer shall make sure that the first aid box or boxes, depending on how many you need, contain suitable first aid equipment, which include at least the equipment listed in the annexure. Now, the annexure is actually found at the end of the document or the regulation. So General Safety Regulations has an annexure at the end with a list of items that must be in a first aid box. Please remember, such an employer shall make sure that only articles and equipment contemplated in subsection A or other similar equipment or medicine is kept in the first aid box. So what is that? What must be in a Regulation 3 first aid box? Well, the one thing you want to do, if you've got an OHSS safety file, go to your register for first aid boxes, and you will notice all the items that are on that register generally include what should be required for a first aid box. That is why you have a monthly inspection. Every month, you check that first aid box to see whether these items are in there. Things like antiseptic wound cleaner, swabs for cleaning wounds, cotton wool for padding. Please remember, cotton wool is not for cleaning. It is used for padding. Then sterile gauze, forceps, scissors, safety pins, triangular bandages, roller bandages, elastic adhesives. Then you have different types of sizes. You might have a roller bandage that is a 100 wide. Then you have a roller bandage that is a 200 wide. So there are different types and then different amounts for each of these items. So this is what you need to have. Please refer to the actual first aid box inspection form to check how many you need to have and the type of bandage that you need as well. Remember, there are different types because you might have a first aid dressing and you might have a bandage, but you have different types of bandages. You have compression bandages for different types of wounds. So we also want to make sure that as a first aider, your responsibility is checking that you have everything that you need. It is not the responsibility of your employer because you as a first aider are taking on that responsibility. Yes, your employer must make sure you have the first aid box, sorry, and the first aid must check the box. Remember, the employer was not trained in first aid. You are the first aider, so you have to actually check what is in the box that is provided by the employer. So please make sure that you're always checking to see that you have the necessary resources to ensure proper first aid treatment for any person within your care in the company. Now, you might be asking the question, but Chris, the law said we have to have a first aid box, but not a first aider. So where does that come into play? Well, that's where General Safety Regulation 3.4 comes in, where more than 10 employees are employed at a workplace. the employer of such employee shall take steps to ensure that for every group of up to 50 people, so you have to have one first aider from 10 employees up to a group of 50, all right, at that workplace. It says at that workplace. In other words, if you have two different offices, well, then you would have a first aider at each office. That just makes sense, because even though you only have 20 employees in total, 10 at one office and 10 in another office, you would require two first aiders. The reason being, it is at that workplace. All right, so you have first aid for the treatment of that workplace. And this is for every group of 50 or 100, depending if you are working in a shop or an office. Then they must be competent as a first aider, and their certificate has to be issued to them by either the Red Cross Society, St. John's Ambulance, the First Aid League, or a personal organization approved by the chief inspector. Please remember, if you have gone for first aid treatment, the company that has trained you to become a first aider now requires to be registered and approved with a CI number from the Department of Labor. If you need any more information on this, please let us know, and we can let you know if you are using a legitimate company to train your first aiders. There is a big issue currently in the area where people are being trained under unit standard instead of being trained in the correct first aid treatments. It's the same unit standard information, but you are not getting credit-bearing training. In other words, they are not giving you a competency certificate. They are giving you a certificate of attendance. And those two certificates are not the same. So please remember, we always want to make use of the correct training providers as well. So this is where we have to have a first aider. Now you might think to yourself, but then if I don't need a first aider from 1 to 9 employees, I only need a first aid box from 5 to 9 employees, how am I going to know how to use the first aid box? Well, that's a good question. You see, because the onus is on the employer to make sure that that individual within their company or any of the employees are able to receive first aid treatment. How you go about doing that is up to you. The legal requirement is that you only need a registered, valid certificate of competency for a first aider from 10 employees. This means that you can go on a basic first aid course. You can go on a life skills course. I mean, in OHSS, we provide life skilled courses for those who don't know how to use first aid boxes. So this is for companies, small companies that only have 5 to 9 employees, and they need to know how to use the actual first aid box. There are courses out there like that, but you don't need to pay for that. You see, you can get manuals for first aid treatment on how to use the actual items within a first aid box. Now, if you don't know how to use a bandage, well, there are YouTube videos to show you how to use a bandage. There are YouTube videos to show you how to use different types of antiseptic, wound treatments, burn creams, and then identifying what is in your first aid kit, you will then know how to look after your employees. But you might say to yourself, well, that's a bit dangerous. I don't really want to be trained by YouTube. Well, there is no legislation saying that you don't have to have a first aider from 1 employee, that you don't have to have a first aider for 5 employees. See, the law is just you have to have one from 10, but there's no law against you having it from 5. So if you are able to, and the budget allows you to train a first aider from 5 employees, the certificate lasts for 3 years. Are you able to do that? Well, that comes down to how you are going to run the business from an employer's perspective. As from an employee's perspective, this is also going to be the decision of your employer. But we want to make sure that prompt first aid treatment is available for employees. So the next first aid box that we spoke about was a Regulation 7. What is the difference? For Regulation 3, we've shown you the list of items. Now, Regulation 7 is not General Safety Regulations 7. It's General Regulation 3, still talking about first aid, but point 7. So Reg 7 comes from General Safety Regulation 3. This is when an employee with an open wound, a cut, a sore, or any similar injury who works in a workplace where substances are contemplated in subsection 5 is used, handled, processed, manufactured, shall report such injury to the employer forthwith. But notice now why the addition to certain requirements is needed in a Regulation 7 box. The employer may not permit such employee to continue working before the injury has been cleaned with soap and water or with a diluted disinfectant. Now, you do have that in a Regulation 3 first aid box, but what is needed in addition to that? Well, in addition to your Regulation 3, you need to have an adequate supply of absorbent material for the blood or any body fluids that have been spilled. Then you must have a disinfectant to disinfect the area after cleaning up the blood or any other blood fluids. You need to have 2 pairs of large or 2 pairs of medium disposable rubber household gloves, and then a suitable sized impervious bag, something that's not going to leak, for the safe disposal of blood and other body fluids. Please remember, this is biohazard materials. You're not going to throw this into general waste. You are going to take it to your local pharmacy and ask them if they can dispose it for you, or a similar waste disposal company that can dispose of blood or body fluids, especially with the first aid materials that have been soaked with that. So that is the only addition in a Regulation 7 first aid kit. Many think that a normal bag is the Regulation 3 and then the big box is the Regulation 7. That is not correct. Those are just different placements for a first aid kit. So you can have a Regulation 7 that is a tiny bag that has everything in it, as long as you have the items inside there. So the Regulation 7 includes what we call a blood spill kit. That is where you are going to get hurt. So we normally use these for factories or offices, especially for plumbers who are working with portable electrical tools such as drills and grinders, because there is more likely a chance of you being affected with a much larger injury because of the types of tools that you are working with. So that's the only addition. So don't think you have to have a huge first aid box on the wall. That's generally there because they last very long, and most people just want to have something that is more sustainable, whereas those little first aid kits sometimes go missing. So we normally use them for compact, putting them inside a vehicle, or perhaps keeping them inside an office cupboard. So do you have a first aid kit in accordance with General Safety Regulation 3, whether it's a Regulation 3 or 7 first aid box that is required? If you have 5 employees currently, do you have a first aid box for every workplace? If you have 10 employees, do you have someone that has a competency certificate for first aid? So, first aid and emergency procedures, when it comes from General Safety Regulation 3, means that an employer must ensure that all his employees or her employees have the needed first aid, emergency equipment, and procedures. So you have to have a first aid procedure. What must be done if there is an incident or an accident that requires first aid treatment? This procedure must be developed by the company and then included in your induction programs for your company. Now, General Safety Regulation 3 does go on to speak about a few extra things, but we won't touch base on that. We just wanted to speak about the roles and responsibilities of the actual first aider. And there's 5 very important things for you as a first aider to remember. And those 5 things are consent, skills, negligence, abandonment, and reporting. The consent means you have to introduce yourself and ask for permission before giving any first aid treatment. You are only allowed to treat for what you are trained for. Please make sure that your certificate is up to date, and that if you have a basic first aid treatment course, life skills course, it might not include CPR, which means you're not allowed to perform CPR. If you have been trained in CPR, CPR will only come in as your first aid level 1 course. That means you have to have a competency certificate for that. Performing CPR on somebody could potentially kill them And so you need to have the correct skills. You cannot perform CPR on someone if you have not been trained and have a certificate to prove that you can do that. Then always render assistance to the best. Ask for help if you need. Never act in negligence if you are a first aider. Never abandon any person that you are treating. Once you start, you do not stop. You are only relieved once the professionals take over. And then give a treatment report to medical professionals when you hand over. In other words, explaining what happened, what treatment you've given, and what condition your injured person is currently in. So what should you know? Your basic modules of a first aid or first aid level 1 will take you through your medical ethics and principles of first aid. It will help you to determine what the primary and secondary surveys are, the disorders of the heart and blood vessels. You'll look at artificial resuscitation or cardiopulmonary resuscitation. You look at choking or upper airway obstructions. That's where you perform the Heimlich maneuver in order to help somebody that is choking. You look at shock and unconsciousness, burns, wounds, bleeding, fractures, soft tissue injuries, and then you'll end on head and spinal injuries. This is a lot of information. You do not want a company that is not competent or not registered to give you this type of training, because it could mean the life of that injured person. So prevention is better than cure. We obviously want to prevent injuries and accidents before they happen. Now, next week, we want to look at basic firefighting, how to use a firefighting equipment such as a hose reel or fire extinguisher. We'll focus more on the fire extinguisher part, but also how many firefighters do you need? And when does a firefighter come into play? Where is this legislation? And then we move on to emergency evacuation and finally arriving alive, driving, and how we must always make sure that we drive safely. But that's all for today. And please remember that email that went out for incidents and accidents to be reported. Please send us that information. If you're worried about the Poppy Act or what information we are trying to collect from you, please send us a personal email, safety@iopsa.org or info@ohss.co.za, and we'll let you know exactly the type of information we need and that your information is going to be 100% protected. We're not going to be contacting you back. We just want the information to work on a method of preventing these incidents and accidents from recurring. We are not going to contact you back about the actual incident and accident and ask you more questions. We only want that information so that we can try and prevent this from happening to another plumber. So thank you very much, and we'll hand it back to you, Byron.